The one thing, as we said, the one thing that scientists, objective science, can't describe is the objective method itself. And we should see why that is. Now, for example, a pen will write on objects, other objects, but it won't write on itself. A knife can cut other objects, but it can't cut itself. If you have a telescope, you can look at other objects, but if you're looking through the telescope, you won't see the telescope and you won't see yourself. So why is this? There's a principle there. Why is this? It's because the knife, the pen, and the telescope, they're being used to operate on other objects, external objects, and they're extensions of the subject. The subject is performing an operation using this tool, and it's performing an operation on objects. So that means that the tool that it's using, the pen or the knife or the telescope, it can't act on itself. So similarly, the scientific method, the objective method, is for working on objects. So that means it can't work on itself. The objective method, the objective scientific method, can't see itself as an object because it's not outside itself. An object is something that's outside ourselves and we can view it objectively. Who can be objective? Can an object be objective? No. A subject is objective. An objective frame of mind, that's a subjective decision, that's a subjective attitude. So the scientific method, the objective method, is a subjective process. And this is the logical weakness, the logical fallacy, which is staring us in the face. So, if we analyze the scientific method, the objective method, we'll see that all the different elements of it, the essential aspects of the scientific method, there'll be real entities. Obviously they're real because they're part of the scientific method, but they can't be described or explained objectively, to some extent, but not fully. So when we analyze the objective scientific method, we're going to come up with a whole class of real entities which exist here in the physical world, but which cannot be fully described or explained objectively. So what are the essential aspects of the objective method? Well, first thing, most noticeable thing is apparatus. Like I described, the cyclotrons, balances, spectrometers. Science uses a huge array of very, very elaborate artificial objects. We've already discussed artificial objects can't come together just by the physical laws alone. And what to speak of scientific apparatus is so specific and so delicately devised. No physical process can do that. So this is the first thing, apparatus. Then second thing, the scientific method is a method of examining experience. So it means we have to perceive. Perception. So perception itself is something which is real. It's a real part of the scientific process. You can't have a scientific process without perception, especially without seeing and hearing. It's not possible. But you can't describe perception. You use perception to perceive other things, but you can't perceive perception itself objectively. We know that we perceive, but you can't see sight. So perception is one aspect of consciousness. Then the second aspect of consciousness, the mind, mental processes. We think, we feel, and we desire. These mental processes are very important parts of science. If a scientist didn't want to come to the truth, in other words, if he didn't have a desire to come to the truth, he wouldn't be able to perform science. If he didn't think, he wouldn't be able to perform science. So these mental processes, they are an essential part of science. And therefore, and they're subjective processes, so the objective method can't describe them. And the third aspect of consciousness is purposeful activity. A scientist has to do things which would not have taken place, you wouldn't expect to take place in the physical world if there was nobody there. The whole scientific process is about creating artificial situations and apparatus. So purposeful activity is also an essential part of the scientific process. So that means that the scientific process can't look at the very fact of purposeful activity. What kind of purposeful activity? Well, especially manipulation by the hands, moving around by the legs, and speaking, communicating. These are three very, very important parts of the scientific process. So, logically, we can see that the objective scientific process can't look at them objectively. What else is involved in the basis of material science? If we think about perception, we can train ourselves to perceive. So, for example, a doctor, supposing somebody's taking up radiography, he has to look at X-rays and he has to interpret the X-rays. Or a therapist. So a therapist is trained to watch the client, and by very, very small, minimal clues, he watches how the pulse goes, changes of colour, changes of expression. There are many clues which show, which show what's going on in the client's mind. In other words, you can train to perceive. So perception is not something that just happens. It seems like a young child has to learn how to use the ability to see. Patients who've been blind from birth for a long time, say for example they have something like a cataract, so they learn to move around by feel. Sometimes when they have the obstruction removed surgically and they can quote unquote see, in other words they're getting visual signals, but it's bewildering for them. They don't know what to do with them. And quite often they just shut their eyes and they go back to feeling their way around again. So perception has to be organized. It's a subjective process and it has to be organized. So what's organizing it? Activity is the same. We organize the way that we act. A drunk person, or a person under drugs, or a small child, or somebody who's got some motor impairment, they've lost the ability to use their limbs, they can't move their limbs properly. But we can learn to use our limbs more effectively. An athlete, for example, or a marksman, they train like this. So there's an agent there, there's a subjective agent, a conscious agent, which is organizing the way that we act. And similarly thinking, we honor Einstein, Darwin, Newton, Descartes. They were very intelligent people. They had learned to control their mental processes in a very specific way to come to a particular goal. So this coordination of perception, coordination of the mental processes, and coordination of physical activity, this is also an essential part of the scientific process. It doesn't happen by itself. So how does it happen? Well, we say, I'm thinking. I've got the idea. I'm perceiving. So in other words, we think that I am doing these things. So then we're saying that the self is the one who's responsible for this. So we can define the self as the real non-physical entity who's coordinating and organizing the conscious faculties, perception, mental process, and physical activity. So this is another essential part of the scientific process. Another part of the process. There's not just one scientist, there's a lot of scientists. And they have this criterion, intersubjective verifiability. It means that any number of scientists should be able to make the same observation, come to the same, and analyze and come to the same conclusions. So that means that there's a correspondence between the states of being, states of consciousness of different conscious beings. That's another part of the community of scientists, the scientific community. That's another essential part of the scientific process. What else? When the scientist is doing science, he has to use his body. And the body has its own metabolism, its tissue, living tissue, the structure of the senses, essentially, which are very which are very essential. So then the body of the scientist, that's also part of the scientific process. So then we can expect that also cannot be explained objectively in terms of simply of physical interactions. Where the body has come from and how it acts, this is also outside the scope of the objective method, the objective scientific method. And then finally, matter itself. All of the apparatus that's used in science, the body of the scientist, it's all matter. So then matter also can't be described purely objectively. Now you can say, oh, that's ridiculous, physical objects, we're describing matter all the time. Yeah, you're describing and measuring in terms of grams, centimeters. So what's a centimeter? How would you objectively describe what a centimeter is? The decision whether you measure in inches or centimeters is completely subjective. Or whether you measure in pounds or grams, it's completely subjective. Degrees Fahrenheit or degrees centigrade, it's completely subjective. And furthermore, the process of measuring is also a subjective process. Measuring doesn't take place spontaneously. If you look on the seashore, you don't see measuring going on. Or on the cliffs, or in a sandstorm. There's no measuring going on. It's a subjective process. So all of these aspects of the scientific process, they're all indescribable in terms simply of in objective terms. That means apparatus, artificial objects that are used in science, the conscious faculties, which means perception, mental process, and purposeful activity. The self, the I, that coordinates the conscious faculties. The universal entity that coordinates all of the scientists and the community of scientists. The body of the scientist and matter itself. These are all essential aspects of the objective scientific process, and they're outside the range of the scientific process itself. So that means that the claim that these things can be described objectively, it's nonsense. It's literally nonsense. Now, according to the Vedic worldview, all of these things are actually produced by inconceivable potency. The Vedic worldview describes how the living entity acts. The living entity is a conscious, non-physical entity, and it acts through the body to produce artificial objects. So it's not just physical, according to the Vedic point of view, it's not just physical laws that are acting. There's consciousness acting there, the individual consciousness, and it's guided by the universal consciousness or the universal self. The conscious faculties, so for example, perception, the faculty for perception, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, these are irreducible aspects of material energy. They're not things which just come together by when physical biological systems become particularly complex, then the faculty for vision comes. This is an absurd idea. According to the Vedic view, these conscious faculties, the mind also, the intelligence, and the faculty for conscious activity, these are irreducible elements, irreducible aspects of material energy. They're there from the beginning. They're built into the universe when the universe is manifested. The conscious self that coordinates the conscious faculties, this is the Atma. It's composed of the potential for personal self-existence, for knowledge, and for satisfaction, bliss, ecstasy. So this is also an irreducible element. The I is not something that comes together when matter becomes complex. It's something which is there in the universe from the very beginning of the universe. The universal coordination of the laws of matter and of the activities of living entities. This universal self, this is also regarded as an irreducible aspect of the material world, the Paramatma. It's an aspect of the Supreme Personality who comes into the material universe and manifests and organizes the whole material universe. Matter is seen as an energy of the universal self. And consequently, the basis of matter also is not, it can't be described just in physical terms. So we see that the doctrine of scientism, the doctrine that everything can be explained physically, it's false and it doesn't make sense. Whereas the Vedic worldview, actually it's in harmony with what we actually observe, with reality as it is, with reality as we directly experience it.